Greetings, Brookings Bio students. This is Mrs. Rydell, and in this video we're going to look a little bit at how molecules move in living things. We're going to start with a video.
Think about what happens if a drop of red dye is added to a beaker of water. The color spreads as the dye molecules move randomly away from each other. In other words, there is a net movement of molecules from the area of high dye concentration, where the dye entered the water, to the area of low dye concentration, the water surrounding the dye. This process is called diffusion. With time, the dye becomes evenly distributed in the beaker. The water in the beaker is a single shade of pink, and diffusion no longer occurs. There is no net movement of dye from one area into another.
We actually did this demo in class and kind of kept an eye on it as we went through the slideshow. For those of you who aren't in class and are watching this later on as a makeup, we kind of did what happened in the little video. We added food color to the beaker and watched those dye molecules as they spread out to fill up the space. And that process of molecules moving to fill a space is called diffusion. And that happens automatically. Molecules have kinetic energy. Their individual molecules are vibrating, they're moving, they bump into each other, and they are always going to move if you place them in a situation where you have a high concentration in one place and a low concentration nearby. They're always going to move from where there's a lot, from where there's a high concentration, to where there's not very many. Areas of low concentration. And it happens anytime there's a difference in the concentration from one place compared to another. We call that a concentration gradient. High molecules in one place, low in a nearby space, those molecules will automatically move to fill up the space. And it happens automatically. We say they move down the concentration gradient. If you think about counting down, when a rocket blasts off, we count down 5, 4, 3, 2. We are doing a countdown. We're moving from a high number to a low number. And molecules do the same thing. When they're moving from a place of high concentration to a place of lower concentration, we say they are moving down their concentration gradient. And you know lots of examples of that. The blue dye in the beaker that we're demoing, or you saw the dye moving in the little video. Someone cooking, making popcorn or grilling out near you, you can smell those food molecules. You can smell what your neighbor has on their grill. If you've ever been in a situation where you're sitting next to someone or nearby someone who's wearing very strong perfume, or next to somebody who didn't shower after gym class, you know those smell molecules can move across from where there's a high concentration to you, where there's a lower concentration. And we all know this situation of someone making a bad smell in the room, and those molecules don't just stay by the person, they spread out across the room and move to fill up the space that's available, and pretty soon people nearby can smell the smell. Diffusion is going to continue until the concentration is equal everywhere in the space. Those dye molecules spread out. In the video they said until it's pink everywhere. And we call that equilibrium. Equal, you can see the word equal in that in the name. Equal concentration of dye molecules everywhere in the space. In cells, molecules need to move. If you think about all those molecules that we learned about, carbs, proteins, nucleic acids, ATP, ions. We talked about all different kinds of substances that are in living things. In a living thing, molecules have to move across cell membranes, not just around in a space, but sometimes they have to pass across a membrane, either to move into a cell or out of a cell. And diffusion can happen across a membrane too. If you put high concentration, these yellow dots, lots of yellow dots at the top box and very few at the bottom, with a membrane in between, high on one side of the membrane, low concentration on the other, those molecules will move by diffusion to cross the membrane and fill up the space equally. as long as the membrane will let the molecule get through the membrane. Remember, membranes are selectively or semi-permeable, and that means not everything can pass through the membrane. Diffusion happens anytime there's a difference in concentration on one side of a membrane compared to the other. So in this little animation, you have these little blue dots representing oxygen. This little yellow rectangle is my cell. You can see the cell membrane around the outside. And they're going to move from where there's a high concentration outside the cell to where there's a lower concentration inside the cell. And as long as the cell membrane lets those molecules pass through, diffusion can move molecules in cells across cell membranes. An example of this, how this works, would be how you get oxygen into your body. Think about if you have a body that's using up oxygen, we have to continuously breathe and take in new oxygen molecules. When you fill your lungs, when you breathe in and fill your lung spaces with air, there's oxygen in there, and it's at a higher concentration in the air, about 20%, 21%, compared to the oxygen that's in your bloodstream. So when you breathe in and put high concentration lung spaces next to low concentration of oxygen in our blood, oxygen will automatically move up through the cells, through the cell membrane, from those air spaces into the bloodstream and get carried to all your body cells. And the same is true for our waste gas, carbon dioxide. As your body does metabolism, it's making a waste called carbon dioxide, and very high in the blood because your body is making it, very little carbon dioxide in your lung spaces, in the air, less than 1% carbon dioxide in the air. And so automatically those carbon dioxide molecules will move from bloodstream, where they're high concentration, into the lung spaces where there's lower, and you exhale and breathe them out. Those molecules go automatically. No one has to pump them. You don't have to think about it. There's not a transporter. You just have to have a high concentration space next to a low concentration space, and those molecules will automatically move across the membrane. Cells have a problem though, because diffusion only moves molecules from high to low, high concentration to low concentration. And diffusion happens pretty slowly. If you were in class, we'd be kind of checking our little demo to see, did we reach equilibrium yet? Are the dye molecules equally spread out? And usually it takes quite a while for the same color to be equal everywhere. It takes a while for diffusion to happen. And diffusion only works if a substance can pass through the cell membrane. And remember, membranes are selectively permeable. Not all molecules can pass through. What determines whether they can pass through are these phobic tails in the center of our bilayer. Remember, membranes are made out of a double layer of phospholipids with the heads facing out and the tails in the middle, like a peanut butter sandwich. And those tails, remember, are very phobic. The heads are polar, they like to touch the water on either side. But the tails are hiding here in the middle because they are very phobic. So if you think about those phobic tails now, they are very phobic. And a lot of molecules don't like to mix or be with phobic things. Things that have a slight charge on them, like polar molecules, water molecules, things that are ions with the actual electric charge on them. If you're a small molecule, if you're a phobic molecule, you don't have any trouble, like oxygen and carbon dioxide we talked about, moving in lung cells. Those molecules don't have any trouble getting across those phobic tails because they are phobic molecules. They like the phobic tails. If you're small, if you're a molecule that doesn't have a charge on it, also those can move across the membrane. But if you are a large molecule, if you're a polar molecule, if you have a charge on it, like an ion, those molecules, those ions, are not going to go anywhere near those phobic tails. They can start through the membrane, they can get near the heads, but as soon as they reach those phobic tails, they are going to hightail it back and not go across the membrane. So how are we going to move those kinds of molecules? What if I want to move a molecule from lower to higher? What if I want to go against the concentration gradient rather than down the concentration gradient? Example. Remember we said mitochondria burn glucose, that if your body is a car, and glucose is the gas you put in your tank, the mitochondria are the engine that's burning that glucose for energy. Remember, this is our power plant. So we want to load as much glucose into our mitochondria as we can. When you're driving your car, you don't wait till the tank totally goes empty. You don't want to run out of gas. And so you fill up the tank before it gets too low. And mitochondria are going to do the same thing. We keep loading glucose, loading glucose, loading glucose into the mitochondria, so we always have our power, our fuel to burn for energy. And that means we have to put glucose where we already have glucose. We have to go low to high. And diffusion is not going to allow us to do that, because remember, diffusion only goes high to low. What if the cell wants to move something really fast? It can't wait for it to diffuse a long distance. Example would be a nerve cell. What makes a nerve send a signal is the flipping of sodium and potassium ions across the cell membrane. And if I have my hand on a hot stove, I don't want to wait for molecules to diffuse slowly all the way up my arm, all the way up to my brain. I want that process to happen very quickly. And so diffusion isn't going to work that way. It doesn't go very fast. What if the cell wants to move something that's really big, or something that's polar, or ions that have a charge on them, and they can't get through those phobic tails? They don't like the phobic. We need ways to do those kinds of transport. And cells have ways to move molecules across the cell membrane, help them get across, that can't go across by themselves. We need some different kinds of transport besides just diffusion. And diffusion works in some cases, like the thing we talked about with the oxygen and carbon dioxide, but it doesn't work in all cases. So we're going to learn another kind of transport. There are lots and lots of different kinds of transporters, and we are not going to go into them and learn all of them. You can read about them in your chapter in your book, or do a little research on the internet if you're interested in other kinds of transporters. But the kinds we are going to learn about, kind of a general types of transporters. And remember, we said molecules that make up cell membranes are the phospholipids and the proteins. Proteins, when we talked about proteins and what they can do, we said one of the things proteins can do is act as transporters to move things in and out of cells. And there are a whole number of different kinds of membrane proteins that can move molecules across a cell membrane, get something from one side of the membrane to the other. So if you look at this little first pink little animation here, the pink is the cell membrane. The little black structure here in the cell membrane is acting like a little doorway, kind of like a little revolving door to move molecules from one side of the membrane to the other. That little mover, the transporter, is a membrane protein. Membrane proteins can act as tunnels. They can have little doorways on them. They can be pumpers. Lots of different kinds of membrane proteins act as transporters. And the other way that things can move into or out of cells is through those vesicles. Remember, we talked about little pond critters, how they could reach out with their cell membrane, ooze, kind of engulf and pull in something, put it in a little vesicle. Or we talked about Golgi bodies and transporters, how we can package something in a vesicle and ship it somewhere. Those little vesicle membrane sacs, if you put something inside, they can pass through that substance through the membrane without that substance actually touching the phobic tails. And those two kinds of ways of moving things across cell membranes are active in cells to move things that can't go across by themselves. The one kind of membrane transporter we're going to learn about moves water. Remember, water is a pretty polar molecule. It doesn't like those phobic tails, and if I'm going to get water molecules, which are pretty important to move where we need them to move in your body across the cell membrane, I need to give them a little tunnel to go through. There are proteins in the cell membrane that can help water molecules get through the membrane without touching the phobic tails in the middle of that membrane sandwich. And they're called aquaporins. Look at the name. Aqua means water, Aquaman. In Spanish, agua means water. And we had this little pore word before. Remember we talked about nuclear pores, pores in your skin, they're openings. And aquaporins are proteins that make openings to allow those very polar water molecules to get past the middle of those phobic tails in the cell membrane. The movement of water across a cell membrane is called osmosis. That's a vocab word. And osmosis still works kind of like diffusion. You have a high concentration of water on one side of the membrane, low on the other, and those little water molecules are going to move through those aquaporins to make the water concentration equal on both sides of the membrane. Make a little slide here about how these two kinds of transport work. Diffusion does not require any energy. We don't have to add ATP molecules to make it go. We don't have to do anything. They're going to move down the concentration gradient from areas of higher to lower concentration. And it works for any molecule that can pass through the membrane. The examples that we used in class were oxygen and carbon dioxide moving in and out of your lung spaces into your bloodstream. Osmosis also does not require energy. It moves down the gradient of water gradient from an area of higher water concentration to lower water concentration. And we're going to use little membrane protein helpers now to help the molecules get across. And the membrane protein helper that we talked about was aquaporins. They're going to help water molecules move through cell membranes. And there's lots of different kinds of membrane transporters. There's transporters for ions, there's transporters for glucose, lots of different kinds of membrane protein helpers. We're going to stop right there. Thanks for watching.